It is Wednesday, March the 21st, 2018. I'm Gord Long. As is normally the case, we have a lot of charts for us to go through this morning, so therefore we will pass over some of them quickly, but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing, or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing in the charts. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's macro online updates. The research document this month updates macro developments. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on our other three report areas of our monthly report: global risk, regional, and U.S. economic developments. As I often do, I'd like to tie them together into a single discussion concerning what I see as the unintended consequences of flawed monetary policy and how we are forcing more and more global corporations to become zombie corporations, where we define a zombie corporation as those whose profits don't meet their financial obligations and therefore must borrow to stay afloat. I would like to therefore cover the items outlined here. Last month, I spent a lot of time on risk and credit in our Under the Lens, long wave, and macro analytic videos. There wasn't sufficient time for other major unintended consequences of monetary policy since the 2008 financial crisis to be covered. Therefore, in each of this two-part Under the Lens series and this month's long wave video, I will be focusing on how loose monetary policy has changed the nature of global capitalism, possibly in a permanent fashion. Today I need to start by reviewing and integrating a few foils from these three prior videos. What we have today is the culmination of nearly 10 years, or a full decade, of monetary malpractice. I firmly believe, as do many other practicing professionals, that we have reached the predictable point of dysfunctional markets and delusional investor expectations. In many previous Under the Lens and long wave videos, available in the Macro Analytics YouTube video archives, we have explored this roadmap regarding why it would unfold. Most of those videos were made in 2012 and earlier. Clearly, the outcome was very predictable. In last month's long wave and macro analytics video, I outlined the reflexive cycle with regard to the pricing of risk and risk transfer. The distortions, shown in red, have in an evolutionary fashion created a self-reflexive loop with reactive strategies, which may become, in fact, the Achilles heel of global markets in the future. Today we are going to try and integrate and touch on how risk is now being attempted to be transferred in China, for example, all as a consequence of the fallout of global policies of financial repression. I co-founded the Financial Repression Authority a number of years ago, and I refer you to its website and numerous podcasts on how destructive these policies were. This chart is taken from our work at the FRA, which detailed why and how central bank macroprudential policies of financial repression are at best monetary malpractice. Someday this will be evident to all and will be detailed in history books as such. It will likely be written in the context of how the capitalist system was corrupted and made dysfunctional with the emergence of creditism. Policies of quantitative easing in its various forms, QE, QQE, ZERP, NERP, Operation Twist, and other EU derivations have resulted in massive distortions, unintended consequences, and moral hazard. I could have just as easily called the two-part Under the Lens series the destruction of capitalism. We have additionally done many videos over the years on the emergence and destructive powers of crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is a modern, politically polite form of the underpinnings of what was once termed by the Italian leader Benito Mussolini as fascism. That is, the merger of the private corporation and the state. Many informed economic researchers would suggest that fascism is nothing more than what can be termed as capitalism in decline. Finally, I concluded last month's Under the Lens video with this IMF prediction of the growing size and expectations of total Chinese debt. I suggested that China does not inject liquidity and credit in the same manner as the rest of the world. This is because of the way the People's Bank of China operates, and that in turn is because the Chinese economy is a mixed economy. That is, China is a quasi-capitalist system. It is very important to understand and appreciate that fact. This stems from the magnitude of central planning, control, and state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, that exist because of its still maintained political foundation based on the Chinese Communist Party. The Communist Party has more authority than the government. In fact, it still is the government. We may all know this, but we tend to forget it or assume it is operating like Western developed nation. It doesn't, and that is a big deal, and it needs to be understood when considering global liquidity, credit formation, and financial flows. We're going to get into that in this session. Separate from China, the public today all seems to be under the mistaken belief that central bankers and government control the economy in such a fashion that debt is simply a matter of accounting, that nations can consume more than they produce, and that somehow it will work itself out, that those with money will always be available and able to lend to those who need to borrow, that the capitalist system mysteriously adjusts all this under the careful and watchful eyes of the thoughtful and competent powers to be. The simple truth is none of that is true. Appreciate that today global debt levels and entitlements by sovereign nations are no longer payable nor extinguishable. There is no longer any possibilities that they can economically grow themselves out of their financial problems within the current definition of a functioning capitalist system. This is also true for household and corporate sector debt levels. Debt growth is far outstripping even exaggerated economic growth expectations. But this is only part of the problem. Debt is one thing, but investment capital is altogether another. Lenders don't lend unless borrowers have collateral. Collateral comes into existence by either growing it, mining it, or building it, not by printing it. We need a functioning economy that is spinning off savings which can be reinvested into productive assets which either create savings or improve productivity, both of which lead to increasing standards of living. Like the farmers of old, there needs to be enough seed corn set aside in the granary for next year's crop. If we feast on it and additionally lend it out to others to enjoy, there will not be a crop next year. Today, the crops get smaller and smaller because less and less seed capital is available or farmers willing to put in the effort to take the risk on a possible crop failure. The major user today of this precious resource of capital is squandering it on malinvestment and massive unsound investments. The world and global economy is going to pay for this. China is its star example of this situation. Let me start getting specific. China is like a vampire, sucking the lifeblood of global capital out of the global economy to stay alive and maintain its social stability. A social stability based on delivering employment for approximately 1.4 billion people. China's debt problem is much more serious than investors fully appreciate. Total government debt, which I will show in a moment, is now larger than U.S. government debt on a GDP basis. How can this be? China is also critically dependent on capital formation or foreign direct investments to maintain its economic edifice. Like a gun to their head, massive and unprecedented levels of global capital flows must be maintained or even increased. Like a risky corporation with a false business model, China is dependent on short-term and these consistent capital flows to stay alive. Kind of a derivative of a Ponzi scheme in many ways. China is now being forced to drain versus accumulate foreign exchange reserves, typically stored in the form of U.S. treasuries, to maintain current and capital account balances. This is a global tectonic shift for China, and as importantly, maybe more importantly, to those debtor nations like the U.S., highly dependent on China buying its debt. It is important to recognize that China does not have a reliable foreign financing network in place like today's many debtor nations. That is because it is presently the central financier to the world. Who could possibly lend a sufficient level to meet China's potential needs if it got into trouble? There is nobody. Additionally, and critically important, China has a zombie quasi-private sector living off the government or surviving through international dumping and highly questionable pricing practices. I'm not saying this because President Trump is yelling about it. It is just simply a fact. All of this is hidden by the belief that China has cheaper labor and therefore can produce cheaper than developed nations with their higher cost base. For anyone who has run a factory, and I'm frankly one of them, you know nothing stands still and labor costs are no longer the major factor in production. Cost of capital, supply chain leverage, taxes on revenue and property, and volumes are much more critical as drivers in modern manufacturing decisions. China's zombie state-owned enterprises are presently being squeezed such that through government-endorsed debt for equity programs, risk and cost reductions are being transferred through stealth entities to wealth management programs held by the public, or by recently merging bank and insurance regulators to allow other financial entities to shoulder, or should I say, high costs. Costs that further allow zombie corporations in China to be price competitive in a world that has lost pricing power through quantitative easing, which fostered oversupply, which we've talked about on numerous previous occasions. Total global debt is expected to reach $233 trillion at the end of Q1 2018. As this chart shows, it was already at 327% of global GDP at the end of Q1 2017. You will quickly notice that total global debt growth since the European banking crisis has been in China, and to a lesser degree the emerging markets, primarily the Asian tigers reliant on Chinese imports. China, since the EU banking crisis earlier this decade, is the global leader in debt creation. When you dissect the global debt a little differently, you see that clearly government debt growth is significant, but the corporate debt growth is now also significant. We're going to talk in much more detail about overall corporate debt growth in part 2, but as far as China is concerned, its debt growth hasn't been in government, though government spending is up significantly. This is because it has been the recipient of massive growth in its foreign exchange currency reserves. So how does China be the largest player in total debt growth, but is not dominated by government debt? That only leaves the private sector of either corporations or households. No doubt household debt growth associated with mortgages and other consumption areas has grown, but it all pales in comparison to private sector corporate debt growth. Private debt is quite literally off the historical charts. It is only marginally comparable to levels prior to World War II and the Japanese economic crisis. For those that can remember the rapid growth and associated reasons for the Japanese crisis, it is eerily similar to the explosive growth and attendant problems now evident in China. But that may be where the similarity ends. I have shown this GDP chart on a number of occasions when talking about China to reinforce how it's structurally different. China doesn't have the personal consumption levels, the trade deficits, nor government spending levels that the U.S. and other developed nations have. Its GDP is different. It is highly built on gross, fixed capital formation and foreign direct investment. It's stunningly high. This chart is just after the financial crisis. I thought it would be interesting to see how it has changed since. Based on the most current data available, we quickly see that capital formation is still the same and critically significant. The bigger shift is in the contributions that consumption and government spending are making. Well, all those ghost cities and malls may employ hundreds of thousands of people, but they cost money to both build and maintain, so government spending is growing fairly significantly. This chart is where things start to get interesting. Clearly, the charts reinforce what we saw earlier, that debt growth is dominated by China. The pink area clearly shows this. With capital formation so high to build factories, etc., how is it that private debt still needs to be so high? The answer lies in remembering that China owns a tremendous number of state-owned corporations which are considered as corporations and lumped together with truly private sector corporations, which in fact are even limited by the nature of Chinese protecting its markets and its corporations, or SOEs. Let's look at debt to GDP impact to appreciate this. China's private sector debt is approximately $17.4 trillion. If we assume 60% of the debt is state-owned enterprises, we have $10.4 trillion. That is 93.1% debt to GDP. The Chinese government debt itself is listed at around 46%. That gives us a total of just under 140%. Comparing that to the U.S. government debt to GDP, it's only 105, and the world is screaming about our level. Moody's latest estimates puts the SOEs, at least according to their definition, debt at 115% of GDP. That would account for approximately 70% of corporate borrowing. So my numbers by any measure are conservative. The question is really whether all this incredible, staggering level of investment is being well spent, or is it malinvestment, or what combination? Because it tells us about what portends for the future. China's 12 biggest companies are all SOEs. The director of Institute for Contemporary Chinese Studies at the Tsinghua University and a vocal proponent of the Communist Party and its state-owned company system said that by 2020, the number of SOEs on the Fortune Global 500 list would hit 130. Remember, this is a state-planned regime. They set goals and target government programs to achieve their stated goals. These are not arbitrary numbers they just pull out of the air. On the recent Global 500 companies, the 54 companies with the biggest losses, 16 were Chinese, the most of any country. Profit doesn't seem to be much of a goal. China has approximately 150,000 SOEs. Let me repeat that. 150,000 SOEs, of which around 50,000, or a third, are owned by the central government itself, and the remainder by the local governments. The central government directly controls and manages 102 strategic SOEs through the State Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, of which 66 are listed on stock exchanges, both domestically and internationally. SOEs, both central and local, account for 30 to 40% of total Chinese GDP and approximately 20% of China's total employment. China's leading SOEs benefit from preferential government policies aimed at developing bigger and stronger national champions. SOEs enjoy favored access to essential economic inputs, land, hydrocarbons, finance, telecoms, electricity, and exercise considerable power in markets like steel and minerals. SOEs have long enjoyed preferential access to credit and the ability to issue a publicly traded equity and debt. SOEs are not subject to the same tax burdens as their private sector competitors. According to some Chinese academics, provincial governments have used their power to manipulate industrial policies and deny operating licenses to domestic and foreign investors in order to persuade reluctant owners to sell out to bigger state-owned suitors. In terms of average assets, SOEs are equal to 13.4 times non-SOEs. Their return on assets don't have to be those required by Western corporations to be competitive and receive investment capital. This is where the advantage or disadvantage lies. Also, state firms are used to buy up natural resources around the globe that are important to China's development. They build infrastructure in developing countries, a core part of Beijing's foreign policy aimed at cultivating friendly nations. Sometimes they are mobilized to defend China's economic interests, as when Aluminum Corporation of China, or Chinalco, spent $13 billion in 2007 buying Rio Tinto shares to stop the Anglo-Australian mining company from merging with BHP Billiton, a merger that could potentially have made it more difficult for China to negotiate prices for iron ore imports by combining two of its three biggest suppliers. They don't operate under anti-monopoly laws like the U.S. Sherman Act. They operate completely differently. What is easy to overlook is that all this comes at a cost. The Comac C919, the single-aisle plane that was supposed to challenge Boeing and Airbus, has been a major money pit and is years overdue. For example, buyers were originally supposed to start taking delivery of the plane in 2014. That's been pushed back to 2018, but delivery could be as late as 2020. Most corporations are out of business, and the plane, when it is delivered, will probably be even outdated. If this doesn't occur, you can be assured it will be priced below Western products, with non-performing loans being the result. It doesn't matter. They don't march to the same drumbeat. Rio Tinto's shares have traded at less than half of what Chinalco's paid for them for most of the time since it acquired them. While China's state companies regularly outbid foreign firms to buy overseas mines, they also routinely overpay for the privilege. Many of the countries where China has built infrastructure are now struggling to repay those loans and have grown increasingly wary of Chinese influence. And in western province of Xinjiang, $317 billion was spent on a forge that's hardly used today. I have example after example of this. It's right across all sectors and across China in total. This chart shows that at least the major SOE Chinese banks are reputed to be profitable. But then, with all this funny credit flowing and government control, it'd be difficult for them not to be profitable, wouldn't it? A few clear monopolies are able to be profitable, but only marginally. I return to this chart on the constituents of the Chinese GDP. What happens to this simply house of cards when the cash stops flowing or even slows marginally? How exactly does a country even possibly think it can maintain a rate of 45.5% gross fixed capital formation? Must have been the same fear that Bernie Madoff had about if the money ever stopped flowing in. How does it maintain this when capital is trying to flee? Most evident recently was the Bitcoin participation, and still is, by the Chinese trying to get their money out of China. And FDI, or foreign direct investment growth, and maintaining is clearly problematic today. I think you get the picture. It is a ticking time bomb that potentially will explode, undoubtedly, taking the global economy, unfortunately, with it. Already loss-making SOEs since 2011 have only increased their loss-making contributions as a percentage of total enterprises by ownership. This is part of lack of pricing power and oversupply associated with Western programs of quantitative easing, etc. It isn't about bringing demand forward, it's about the massive ramp-up of supply. And China's feeling that, having benefited initially, but seeing a loss of pricing power to maintain increasing cost pressures. I've talked a number of times recently about the importance and significance of the reversal in the credit impulse measure and how China presently dominates it. And it's in trouble, serious trouble, or we're in trouble actually. On the surface, things have appeared positive in China since they startled the market with a surprise and forced yuan devaluation in August of 2015. Until the October Party Congress was held and President Xi Jinping was given powers for life, it was expected China wouldn't attempt to undertake any of the changes that are clearly and seriously required here. There is little doubt they will be unpopular and disruptive, and possibly much too late. Remember, social stability of 1.4 billion people is central to the Communist Party's goals and planning. Remember also, today any problems in China will be felt around the world. The world's banker is not someone you want to see having problems when everyone else is up to their eyeballs in debt and looming unfunded entitlement obligations are around the corner. Even this chart from Richard Duncan, which I ended with last month, suggests Richard himself is skeptical the credit tsunami emanating from China will in actual fact occur. Maybe Richard sees a lot of things others don't, like the incredible complexity of the Chinese shadow banking system. No one really knows how much bad debt is also hidden here, as local governments pledge government land to receive loans, to boost local GDP measures, to keep their government positions based on achieving those economic growth metrics. Global shadow bank lending, according to the Bank of International Settlements, approximates the global GDP at around 72 trillion. We can assume China has at least this ratio. That suggests another 12 trillion of loans somewhere in the plumbing of the Chinese financial system. I recently reviewed a whole series of charts regarding the growth of global balance sheets. I was stunned to see that global bank assets have been predominantly falling for minimally the last couple of years, if not longer. Global banks across the board are not lending. They have battened down the hatches. What is it they know and are obviously preparing for when there are so many borrowers out there needing more loans? Banks only lend when they know they will get their money back with interest paid. The Great Depression was marked by banks also not lending and then seizing the collateral used to secure loans. borrowers lost everything, and banks were then hated. Maybe the banks see in China what we have just had a peek at here today. As I always do, in closing, remember, the answer to everything will be to simply print more money. It's the only answers politicians will ever agree on until no one wants it or trusts it, that is, the money they print, invest accordingly. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading. Make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2018 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I thank you for listening.